One of my favorite things about CPA.com's CAS Benchmark Survey is finding data points that relate to one another that aren't innately apparent in the data. So you're looking at two disparate data points. How did those actually work together to drive some kind of insight? There is so much information in this benchmark survey. Today, we're going to talk about future-proofing as it relates to tech adoption for growth and retention. Let's dive in. All right, welcome back to another episode of CAS Minute. Today, we're talking about future-proofing CAS. What does tech adoption for growth look like? Retention. Today, we're going to talk about how those technology choices influence client retention, employee satisfaction, and firm scalability. So the first data point I want to bring out in the CPA.com CAS Benchmark Survey is data points between technology setup fees and client retention. So firms charging separate tech setup fees report higher CAS revenue per client, about $23,129 per year versus $17,867 per year. It makes sense, right? You charge a separate tech setup fee and you get higher dollars of revenue per client. That makes sense. One thing that it doesn't go into as much detail on is what exactly are those tech setup fees for? Is this a standard onboarding charge? Is this onboarding of new technology? Is it setting up the CAS firm's tech stack onto the client? In either scenario, what we're looking to do is set up this psychological commitment of dollars to the value that we're driving as firms. So if we have a tech stack and we believe that these three tools are going to help our client achieve a better outcome, we should be charging for that value. And so we want to standardize setup fees, bundle them with potentially longer-term contracts in order to maximize that retention and revenue. It's one of those things that maybe we tend to do on our own, we tend to do because it'll make our lives easier, but at the end of the day, it should be driving value back to the client, and that is worth charging for, as evidenced by the higher reported fees per client versus those firms that do not charge those setup fees. The second thing I want to talk about is client turnover versus staff turnover. So client turnover of about 10% aligns with staff turnover about 7%. That suggests some degree of correlation between when staff turns over, maybe there's a higher likelihood that a client is going to turn over. So it's not necessarily a hidden insight that stable teams foster stronger client relationships. However, it is a data point to say, hey, how can we invest in team satisfaction programs, introduce performance-based compensation, leadership training in order to create more stability there? We know that recruitment and retention is a really challenging endeavor for most firms today. And so I think there's two elements to this. One, how do we invest in our teams? And two, how do we decouple the staff turnover and client turnover through the lens of creating a more holistic, consistent communication strategy with our clients? That may reduce this correlated data because you're now creating consistent experiences across your entire client base, no matter who is serving that client. There may be something there. The last thing I want to hit on is outsourcing versus efficiency gains. Only 26% of firms use what they would consider an offshore staff, yet those firms do report higher margins and client efficiency. There are two different trains of thought here. One, yes, you can go offshore and report higher margins. That's true. I talked to a number of firms that have big teams in India, and they can effectively have one person per client that's focused on that client full time and still see 70% margins. It's that kind of thinking that I think leads to maybe a weaker work culture, in that if you're trying to look offshore for transactional tasks while reserving domestic teams for high-value advisory work, you're starting to create this distance between the team, particularly for the team that's not in your backyard, in that there may not be as equal of an opportunity for advancements, for growth, for learning. And so I don't really ever want to think about the offshore team as only doing the transactional tasks. Matter of fact, I don't even want to call them an offshore team, because that immediately creates distance in your mental model of how you think about a team that doesn't live in your backyard. I do believe there is a place for a globalized workforce in CAS practices, but it's how you weave that into your operations, how you weave the learning and development, how you bring those folks into your culture and create the same opportunity for folks outside of your backyard that are in your backyard. And so there is this interesting balance of trying to chase a higher margin, to invest more in the business, while also keeping prices low for clients and making sure that you're delivering the value relative to what you're charging for. There's this mantra that we need to continue increasing prices, but at the same time, we're getting a lot of price pressure downward by productized solutions. So thinking about that is something that is really polarizing to me. It's something that I'm very interested in. But I think some of those data points are fascinating coming out of this CAS Benchmark survey in terms of like how do you manage charging for tech setup fees? How do you manage team and client turnover? And then is there a place for globalization of your workforce? Some of those insights can be found in this survey relative to what's happening currently in the industry. Take a look at it, and we're going to dive in a little bit more next time.